Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Very nice to be here. My name is Nick Lane. I'm the Chief Insight Analyst at Mobilesquared, and I'm here obviously to talk about engagement in an omnichannel world. What I'm going to do is share some insights that we have just looking at the UK market, and then I'm going to work my way towards looking at the impact engagement can have when you move to a richer environment in messaging. So for those of you who aren't familiar, and I'm sure there are many, Mobilesquared's the #1 business messaging intelligence provider. We work with all of these companies and many, many more, providing our forecast and insight into the business messaging space. And we've recently launched a product called Message Map IQ, and that provides a very granular view of any of the 200 markets that we cover, from subscribers all the way up to engagement and different types of use cases. So as you can see, what we typically do is take clients on a journey, and I'll do that with you today. So we look at the population, look at the breakout of mobile operators, and then the key thing for us is the unique mobile users. So I'll come on to that in the next slide. Then we break things out by channel. We split things by gender, by demographic, then we look at the verticals and the different types of use cases. Then when you have that, you're typically left with your target group in terms of who you are obviously trying to reach with any campaign through the medium of messaging. So the family tree we now call the mobile tree, and this is why. So typically when you'll get data on a mobile market, it's often in subscriptions. And again, that can be misleading given the fact that a number of people have multiple devices and they also have multiple smartphones these days. So we've used a lot of research to calculate what that unique mobile user number is for each market. And then as you can see, we split it out by gender, by demographics. So this is typically the starting point for how we now look at the marketplace. So in the UK, has a population of just under 68 million. And you can see from on here, although my head just covers one bit, that there's about 11.5 million people without a phone. But there are nearly 80 million total mobile subscriptions. So again, you can see that the penetration somewhere between getting close to about 120%. So in terms of unique mobile users, UMUs, there's about 56.3 million of those in the UK. And as you can see, what we do is we split it out by non-smartphone users and by smartphone users. And in terms of smartphone users, we then split that out in terms of Apple, which is the dominant smartphone, and OS, and Android. And we do have other unique smartphone users, but to be honest, the percentage of those devices is so small, it hardly registers on any of the graphs. It is there, but it's just going to be a very thin slice, basically. So if we look at a split of where the UK, as you can see, in terms of unique mobile users, we split it out by operators. We then split out the operator data in terms of the demographic, and we also do that in terms of the type of device that they have. So I won't dwell on these because there's far more interesting data towards the end of the presentation. Not that this isn't. The other thing I think you've got to look at as well is, as you're looking at creating a messaging campaign in this omnichannel environment, what is the device you're reaching? So again, by splitting things out between smartphone and non-smartphone, it really gives you an idea of the potential richness in any campaign that you can send as a message to your target audience. Now, the penetration of smartphones is about 86% in the UK, so it's very high, and that's fairly evenly distributed between the different age groups. So again, that makes the UK quite a unique market. Normally on this slide here, you typically see more of a kind of jagged edge between smartphone and non-smartphone. And again, you've got your breakdown here in terms of the device by demographic. But as you can see, typically 86% of users have potentially a rich messaging experience. So now just going to look at messaging. So some of this will need explaining. So for every unique mobile user, you have a device, you can receive an SMS. So SMS has 100% penetration in any market. Because there's an Apple penetration of just under 53%. Typically, if you target Apple, you will reach 53%. And the same applies with Android, although Android is slightly different because obviously within the UK, RCS has now been launched and operators are now offering the business messaging version, RBM. I'm sure you've already heard lots about that today. But not every Android device in the UK is actually on RCS. So again, you've got this split of, so you've got the Android users who are now on RCS, and they account for about 17% of users in the UK. And you've got Android users that are not on RCS and therefore still on SMS. So they account for just under 16%. Then you have the non-smartphone users, and they account for 14% of users. So again, even today, there's still a large percentage or large number of people who don't have a smartphone. So again, when you're thinking about how do you message these people, SMS still has to play a role. So as you can see, also we've kind of split everything out by operator, but we won't need to go into that. So when you look at how far reaching each messaging channel is, so obviously we've got SMS, which is 100% of unique mobile users, and it accounts for 83% of the total population. WhatsApp is the largest OTT messaging app in the UK. It has just about 38,500 users. That's 57%. iMessage, which is effectively Apple and ABC, but again, it's a potential platform that can be used and maybe might evolve into a business messaging channel, but I'll come on to that. And again, that's just under 30 million. Facebook Messenger has about 24 million users, and you can see we have RCS just under 10 million as of the end of 2020, and I hope that's very similar to what Ben has just said. So in terms of just SMS only users, it's about 8 million. So when you're creating a campaign and you want to reach 100%, how do you do it? So this chart here really shows that ultimately the most ubiquitous platform is obviously SMS, but if you wanted to base something around iMessage and Apple users, for example, let's say in the world of business messaging, you can use iMessage, you'd reach about 53%, but you'd still rely on SMS to back up that remaining 47% of users who aren't on an iPhone. Similar kind of thing with Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and of course RCS. So whatever happens, there's always going to be some kind of SMS backup when you're creating your campaign. So here we've just broken out the various platforms by mobile operator. And what we've also done on the right here, as you look, is look at the average reach of channel per demographic. So what's quite interesting here is typically whatever the demographic is. So for example, on SMS, for each demographic, you're reaching in 10 million users. So that is really far reaching, and it still is an incredibly powerful medium. And we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, unprecedented growth of businesses using messaging as a way of getting that direct communication to their customers and potential customers. The other interesting thing here is in terms of OTT, so over the top. So that is something like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and obviously if Apple does something with its Apple Business Chat ABC, the reach, the average reach there isn't that far short as you'd expect. It's obviously only 86% of the ubiquitous SMS. So it still could be very far reaching. So again, as you start to think of how do you develop a messaging campaign over different channels, these are the kind of numbers that are really going to start to play a key role as you move things forward. And again, this is just breaking it down in a slightly different way, so I won't dwell on that anymore. So when it comes to engagement, this is where things get, I think, really interesting. You've heard of engagement within the industry, and I'm sure this will be mentioned repeatedly today. Conversational commerce is very much the buzzword within the industry. Everyone loves it. It's been around for a few years now, and it's really starting to get some traction. So what I'm going to show you now is all based on Mobilesquared data. It's based on industry research that companies have shared with us. It's also based on some trials and some actual commercial data shared with us from things like RCS, for example. But before we get there, just want to look at the whole area of opt-ins, because obviously as typically everyone moves from a kind of telco oriented SMS model where you do need opt-ins, it's understanding who do people want to hear from. So again, this is based on some research. So the blue denotes an opt-in user base, so typically people less than 10 million. The green is between 10 and 20 million, and the red is over 20 million. So as you can see, there are 5 sectors where there are over 20 million people in the UK that want to or do communicate with brands and enterprises in these sectors. So obviously entertainment's one of the biggest, 25 million people. You've got leisure, 22, travel, 22, but they might be on hold sadly, but hopefully for not too long. But retail is 22 million, and I would imagine that figure's probably grown significantly, certainly over the last 12 months. On average, each sector has an audience on messaging for SMS, this is, for about just under 15 million people. So that's really encouraging. It shows that people are no longer precious about giving their mobile number to companies as they were maybe several years ago. It's now used very much as an identifier. And that's one of the key things moving forward. And I think the other thing that's really key to understand is from an SMS perspective, a lot of that traffic from a consumer to consumer, so when you're texting friends or family, a lot of that now is on WhatsApp. So as a channel, SMS is now very clear for these kind of A to P business messages coming from dentists, schools, supermarkets, and so on and so forth. So when you think about how you communicate with these people, you've got to understand what is that breakout of those opt-ins. And typically you will have 86% who will be on the smartphone and around 14% who will not. So therefore, if you want to reach everyone in that database of your database, however big it is, you've got to make sure that you've always got something in there that meets the SMS requirement, regardless of whether you are starting to create quite a rich strategy. The next thing to really understand as you start to develop the engagement is what are you going to communicate? So we typically break things down into kind of 6 categories. So alerts, customer service, marketing and promo, path to purchase, reminders, and security. Now, of these, alerts and security will never really drive engagement. They're very much kind of one-term unilateral message. You wouldn't expect the consumer to reply to that. So then you're really left with 4 categories in terms of engagement. So if we just look at each one in turns, customer service is by far the biggest in terms of potential engagement between consumer and a brand. And a lot of, for example, WhatsApp are very much using that as a way of using WhatsApp businesses and brands to help with their customer care. And Apple is certainly doing that approach as well with ABC. But on average, what you can see is almost 50% of users who will use RCS will expect to use RCS for customer service. That figure is actually higher with iMessage. In terms of WhatsApp and Facebook, although they're not on here, the engagement levels are lower because there's still some resistance potentially from consumers because they still see those channels very much as a consumer to consumer service. But if there is going to be one element that can potentially disrupt the norm from, for example, a mobile operator's perspective, it will be Facebook. And they are really going gung-ho in terms of trying to make sure that WhatsApp business in particular becomes a very strong and powerful channel. Not surprising, given in the UK, it has 57% penetration or so. So customer service, very powerful, will be a very powerful channel and a great way of communicating for a brand and a customer. Then we can look at the path to purchase, and again, some very similar figures. Now the average engagement percentage of users does drop slightly, but it's still incredibly encouraging. It's about 30%, 7% on RCS, just again slightly higher. On iMessage, it's about 39%. But if you look at where that is compared to SMS, that's 12%. So again, in terms of as you look to understand what messaging and the various channels can bring to your business in terms of comms, anything you're doing with SMS is going to exponentially grow. because of the potential engagement when you move to a rich messaging channel, whether that is RCS, Facebook, or whatever else is out there. So that's going to be the key thing as you move forward. Reminders, you can clearly see that people on an iPhone age 30 to 49 are possibly the most forgetful, which is why they need reminders. But again, this shows this is something that's really powerful and is a great, it shows that messaging is a great way of just sending something very simple to a consumer, and potentially if you want to change an appointment or add an element or something to that message, you can do that within the messaging channel. So again, there's high demand there for usage. So marketing and promo. This is perhaps from an RCS perspective, a Facebook Messenger perspective as well, one of maybe the key channels and the key use cases in terms of what brands can look to do because of the element of engagement on this. So as again, in terms of from the average, you typically see SMS engagement on 16% on a very strong campaign. That will grow to about 39% on RCS, and again slightly higher, about 43% on iPhone, on iMessage. So what I want to do now is just kind of play around with things slightly and just kind of create some kind of false campaigns just to show you the impact that rich messaging is really going to have as you move forward. So if we look at SMS, so if this is a brand X, they decide to send out 1 million messages because they've got a database of 1 million people. So we now know already that they will reach 1 million users with SMS. Potentially they'll reach 527,000 users on Apple, 173,000 on RCS. If they wanted, they could mix up RCS, Apple and SMS, but regardless, on these two channels, you are going to rely on some kind of SMS support. So we've sent our messages. These have been delivered. Now, based on the read rates that we now understand in terms of fully very kind of understood in the SMS environment, and getting a lot of clear data now in terms of the rich messaging environment, typically 90% of messages will be read on SMS. 90% will be read in 3 minutes. That's a stat from Mobilesquared, which we released about 11 years ago and is still used and quoted today. So we're very proud of that fact. It's about 75% open or read rate when you move to something like Apple or the kind of rich messaging environment. So it has dropped slightly. We do probably believe actually that the 90% figure in SMS is probably lower now, and that's because there's a lot more traffic coming into the home screen. So there are more things coming in, which means some things might get pushed off the home screen before you get the chance to look at them. But either way, compared to any other medium, messaging is by far the most effective. So if we then look at the potential in terms of who then will become active, so what we've already seen looking from RCS, for example, and looking at SMS, about 16% of users on SMS will be active, about 39% on RCS. So that gives you an indication of potentially people that once have read a message will do something. They will then potentially engage with a brand. So as you click through, so the percentage of those users that will then click through from reading become a kind of user reactive and become an active user, this is what it actually means. So from the original starting point, it's about 5.4% of those 1 million SMS users, and it's about 17% of those rich messaging users. But when you then put that as, and you look at that just in kind of isolation in terms of who's actually opened and then obviously continued their journey within that engagement, that figure's typically about 6% in SMS, and it's about 22% in rich messaging. So we'll start to kind of flesh out a bit more details now in terms of we're developing this campaign idea and the impact of engagement. Now, as we move from what is effectively an analog environment in SMS to a digital world in terms of rich messaging, things change. And what you start to see is the number of brands that people are likely to engage with increases dramatically. So what we've identified are 3 different kind of use cases. So you've got the normal rich messaging user, a heavy user, and a super user. So the normal user will typically engage with about 6 brands on a regular basis. They're likely to interact, but it would be a kind of passive engagement. You've then got the heavy user. They're likely to engage with more brands, up to about 15. They are considerably more likely to engage and also complete a transaction. They're also likely to start a conversation with the brand, and I'll come on to that in a few moments. Then you've got the super user. These are the influencers. These are the guys, the brand ambassadors. These are the guys that you need to identify, because these have a very, very powerful impact on the success of any campaign in messaging. They are going to interact with brands. They're going to be sending brands messages. These are the people that can influence their own community. So the super users are very, very key moving forward. And this is why. So what we've done is just taken, again, a million messages. So we're now assuming that this database has 1 million smartphone users, not worried about which channel is for the time being. Let's say it's RCS if you like. So you've got 1 million users, and 1 million RCS messages, let's say, have been now sent out. Now, based on what we understand in terms of the breakdown from users from our research, normal users account for about 77% of a database. Heavy users would be about 20%, and super users are just 3%. Now, with each step of any campaign, the prevalence of super users grows. So as you can see over these 4 steps, where we've got the starting point in terms of messages being delivered, in terms of the percentage of those users that are likely to read that message, and then their intention to move along the journey and even complete the journey. So what this actually shows is what we would expect is about 5.8% of total users in this model to actually complete the journey, whether it's to complete a transaction or engage with the brand in a particular way, make a booking or do something. But when you break that out, as you can see, of that percentage, of that 6%, over half is based on super users, 37% on heavy, and 11% of normal. And as you can see, the percentage of users completing that journey is significantly weighted in a super user way. So in theory, 1 in 5 would potentially connect with the brand, 1 in 10 of a heavy user, and I can't even do it, about 1 in 28%, or 1 in 28 in normal users. So again, identifying who these different users are. So that's in a rich messaging environment. What happens with engagement and SMS? Completely different. Normal is the normal user, primarily 100% of the user base, because it's obviously far more difficult to engage and follow multiple brands. Although there are different classifications, typically we're just using the similar kind of classification for normal that we've used in the other model. And it shows that going from 1 million typically down all the way to this conversation, the conversion or purchase, you're left with 2%. So that really shows that you get about 16% of users engaging with an SMS message, 2% are likely to complete their journey. So big finding. Rich messaging versus SMS delivers about, in this model, delivers about 195% uplift, which is very encouraging. But what does that also mean? The bigger picture really, and I'm just working towards a big statement, is that what we're seeing is that rich messaging, and messaging in particular, is now becoming the next mega platform for brands and enterprises to communicate with customers. And it makes perfect sense for this to happen, because if you look at mobile internet users here, you've got over 4 billion. You've got nearly 3.9 billion mobile social media users. Facebook has revenues of 90 billion with ARPU of $30 per year. So then if you look at the scale of users, you then apply that to the number of smartphone users. So again, these are our smartphone unique users, just under 3.5 billion. Now we know that there's more than 3.3 billion users of messaging apps on smartphones. And it's quite an easy one to calculate, because WhatsApp has over 2.2 billion users, and the majority of those can't be used in China. WeChat has over 1.1 billion users, and the majority of those aren't used outside of China. So you've got 3.3 billion as a starting point right there. So messaging, we believe, is really only the tip of the iceberg. Very much cliched statement, I'm afraid, but in terms of the growth and the ability and how brands can use it, I think we're only just at the start of this journey. Because I think the other thing that we need to remember is really understand the size of each market, where we've got lots of different markets now converging in this rich messaging environment. We've got the traditional A2P SMS, as we know it's just SMS from businesses. That's worth approximately $21 billion. You've got customer care. That's worth over $1 trillion. Mobile advertising. And again, this is an industry that's grown from 0 to $200 billion in 15 years. And the same with apps. These are not our forecasts, by the way. But it shows the mobile app market, this is for 2023, could be worth nearly $1 trillion. Again, that's a 15-year market. So in terms of rich messaging, we're probably at the equivalent of about the first year of that journey. So there's a long way to go, but we're still just starting to understand how we use things, what we do things. So just to leave you with some last thoughts, it's really understanding what rich messaging can do for your business. Is it the right channel for the type of communication that you want to send out? And also you've got to understand who you're trying to reach. This is all very basics, all 101 stuff. But this is where I think things get slightly different. A lot of brands will ask their messaging provider to sense check their database, their mobile database, to ask, for example, how many RCS users are there. If it comes back at 10%, then typically the brand will say, well, why are we using it? We can reach 100% on SMS. Why do we want to only reach 10%? If we go back to the model that we looked at in terms of level of engagement, if we base that on a campaign to sell a product for £10, you would only need to send a third of the messages on rich messaging compared to SMS to create the same level of return on investment. So again, it shows because of the engagement that's been generated by whatever kind of rich messaging you're on, it's fundamentally more powerful. So you don't need a big base to start using it. So our message really is start using rich messaging now, don't wait. It is not going away. It's only going to get bigger. It's only going to get better. And it will become a very strategic channel for your business comms. So start using it now. Don't wait, and you will get ahead. The other thing, lastly, to think of is that with Twitter, a lot of brands don't have very many followers on Twitter, but they're all on it. So you've got to start somewhere. So that's me done. Thank you very much.